You walked into the hobby shop and you saw the box behind the glass, and your whole chest tightened because there he was, Frankenstein, painted in colors you had never seen before because the movies were black and white, but this box was green and gray and red, and his arms were reaching out towards you, and the price tag said 98 cents, and you had $1 in your pocket, and that was the day everything changed. Before we go any further, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments which monster you built first. The hobby shop was the place where your allowance disappeared in 15 minutes. It smelled the way no store smells anymore, a mix of balsa wood and paint thinner, and the sharp sweetness of Testor's cement leaking from tubes that were never fully closed. And the model kits were stacked on wooden shelves behind the counter or hanging on pegboard walls in cellophane-wrapped boxes. And you walked past the airplane kits and past the car kits and past the ship kits, and you went straight to the monster kits, because the monster kits were the only ones that mattered, and the only company that made them was Aurora, and Aurora was about to become the most important word in your vocabulary for the next 5 years of your life. The box was the first thing that got you, not the kit inside, the box. Because some artist in New York named James Bama had painted what was on that box. And what he had painted was Frankenstein in full color, standing in a dungeon with one arm raised and his face stitched together and his skin a deep, unsettling green that you had never seen before, because every time you had watched that monster on television, he was gray. He was always gray. The Universal movies were black and white, and you had never imagined what color his skin actually was. And James Bama answered that question for you on the front of a 98-cent box, and the answer stayed with you for the rest of your life. You tore the cellophane off before you got home. That sound, the crinkle and rip of tight plastic wrap coming apart in your hands, was the sound of every Aurora monster kit you would ever build. And you heard it so many times across so many months and years that it became a sound as familiar to you as your own front door opening. Inside the cellophane was a box, and inside the box were gray plastic parts connected to runners that Aurora called sprues, and the parts looked nothing whatsoever resembling the painting on the front. They looked like random shapes attached to sticks, and there was a folded instruction sheet with numbered diagrams showing you where each part went. And there was nothing else. No glue, no paint, no brush, just gray plastic and a promise that if you followed the numbers, you would have a monster standing on your desk by the end of the night. The glue was sold separately, and this is important because the glue is the thing you remember most. You remember it more than the monsters. You remember it more than the painting on the box. You remember it more than the hobby shop itself. Testor's cement came in a small metal tube with a yellow label and a red cap. And when you unscrewed that cap, the smell rose out of it and hit you in the face, and it was sweet and sharp and chemical, and it made your eyes water if you held it too close. And it was not really glue at all, it was solvent. It melted the plastic where it touched and fused the pieces together at the molecular level. And you did not know that word when you were 10, but you knew what happened. You watched the plastic soften under the clear liquid, and you pressed the two parts together and held them with your fingers and counted to 30. And when you let go, they were one piece and they would never come apart again. And that was the closest thing to magic you had ever performed with your own hands. You built the first one on the kitchen table, but after that you built them somewhere else. You built them in your bedroom with the door closed. You built them in the basement on a card table your father did not use anymore. You built them at your best friend's house because his parents did not mind the smell. You built them in secret, not because anyone told you to hide, but because the monsters were yours. They belonged to a part of you that you did not share with anyone except the other boys who built them too. There was a name for boys who built Aurora monsters even though nobody ever said it out loud. You were a monster kid, And being a monster kid was a membership in a club that had no meetings and no president and no rules except one. That rule was that you bought Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine at the drugstore and you read it cover to cover. You studied the ads in the back because that was where Aurora told you what was coming next. The ads were not just in Famous Monsters, they were in the back of every comic book you owned, right next to the ads for Sea Monkeys and X-ray specs and the Polaris nuclear submarine. The Aurora ad was always the same, a drawing of a monster with a dotted line around it, and a price that you could afford and an address you could mail a money order to. Sometimes you did mail it, and sometimes you walked into the hobby shop instead because you could not wait 4 to 6 weeks for delivery when the monster was right there behind the glass waiting for you to take it home. You painted them because gray was not acceptable. Frankenstein had to be green. Dracula's cape had to be black with a red lining. The Wolfman had to be brown with gray streaks. The mummy had to be tan with darker wrappings. And the red paint, there was always red somewhere, on the teeth, on the fingertips, on the base where the monster stood. You painted those details with a brush so thin it had maybe 6 hairs on it, and your hand shook because one wrong move would put red on the green and you would have to start over or live with it. Most of the time you lived with it because the Testor's enamel paint was not forgiving. It dried fast and it dried permanent, and whatever you put down in the first stroke was what stayed. You learned more about patience and precision from painting a 98-cent Frankenstein kit than you learned from any class you ever sat through in school. The moment you finished one was the moment you understood why you built it. You held it up at arm's length and turned it slowly in the light. The paint was still tacky in places and the glue joints were visible if you looked too closely. One arm was slightly crooked because you had not held it long enough while the cement set, but none of that mattered because you had taken a pile of gray plastic shapes on sticks and turned them into a monster, a real monster, standing on a base with his name on it. He was yours and you had made him with your own hands. And there was no feeling in the world that came close to that. Not opening a birthday present, not catching a fly ball, not anything. Because those things were given to you or happened to you, but this thing you had created. Creation is a different kind of joy entirely. And then there was the giant Frankenstein, 19 inches tall, with movable arms and chains you could actually wrap around his wrists, and a level of detail that made the regular kit look like a toy. Of course it was. But the giant did not feel like a toy. The giant felt like a sculpture. It cost $4.95, which was 5 times the price of the regular kit. You saved for it for weeks, or you put it on your Christmas list and circled it 3 times in the Aurora catalog. On Christmas morning, when you saw the shape of that box under the tree, you knew exactly what it was before you tore the first piece of wrapping paper. Your hands were shaking because this was the one. This was the monster that would stand at the center of the shelf and make every other kit look like they were standing in his shadow. The shelf was where they lived. Not a display case, not a cabinet, just the shelf above your desk, or the shelf above your bed, or the top of your dresser. The monsters stood there in a row, and the row grew longer every month. Because once you built Frankenstein, you needed Dracula, and once you had Dracula, you needed the Wolfman, and once you had the Wolfman, you needed the creature from the Black Lagoon, and once you had the creature, you needed the Phantom of the Opera, and the Mummy, and Godzilla, and King Kong. There was one called The Forgotten Prisoner of Castel Mare. That was just a skeleton chained to a castle wall. It was the most haunting thing on the entire shelf because it had no face and no story. It was just bones and chains and silence, and you put it at the end of the row where it could watch the others from the darkness. Every monster on that shelf had a personality that had nothing to do with the movie it came from and everything to do with what you decided it meant. Your Frankenstein was not Boris Karloff's Frankenstein. He was yours, painted the exact shade of green you mixed yourself from 2 bottles of Testor's enamel, and the stitches on his forehead were the ones you painted with a hand that was steadier than it had any right to be at age 11. Your Dracula stood with his cape open and his fangs showing, and you had given him eyes that were red instead of the white the instructions suggested, because your Dracula was angrier than the one on the box. Every boy who built the same kit ended up with a different monster, and when your friend came over and looked at your shelf and compared it to his own shelf at home, you both knew that no 2 Frankensteins in America were the same color green because no 2 boys mixed the paint the same way, and that was the whole point. Then Aurora did something that changed the shelf forever. They released the Frightening Lightning series. These were the same monsters molded in plastic that glowed in the dark. You bought Frankenstein again even though you already had him because this one glowed. At night, when your mother turned off the hallway light and your bedroom went dark, the monsters on the shelf began to shine. A pale green light pulsed from inside the plastic. You lay in bed and looked at them, and they looked back at you. The room was completely dark except for the glow of 5 or 6 monsters standing at attention on the shelf above your head. It was the most frightening and the most comforting sight of your entire childhood. The monsters were yours, they were guarding you, and nothing in the dark was worse than what was already on your shelf. There were also monsters you did not expect. Aurora made Dracula's dragster, a hot rod with Dracula at the wheel, a bat on the hood, and a coffin where the trunk should be. They made the Wolfman's wagon, the Mummy's chariot, and Godzilla's go-kart. Every one of them was ridiculous, and every one of them was perfect. When you were 11 years old, a Wolfman driving a custom rod was not a contradiction. It was the logical extension of everything you loved, combined into one box for $1.25. None of this was supposed to happen. A man named Bill Silverstein worked for Aurora in 1961, and he saw a line of children wrapped around a city block in New York, waiting to see a double feature of the original Dracula and Frankenstein films. He walked into a meeting and said we should make model kits of these monsters, and the room said no. Children would have nightmares, parents would complain, retailers would refuse to stock them. He spent months trying to convince them. A psychiatrist made a public statement that the kits would actually help children process fear by giving them something to hold, something to control, something to build with their own hands. Aurora made a prototype Frankenstein and brought it to the Hobby Industry Association show in Chicago, and for 4 days nobody looked at it. On the last day, a distributor brought his 2 sons to the show floor, and the boys ran past every airplane and every car and every ship and grabbed the Frankenstein. The distributor placed an order, and a few more orders followed. Aurora shipped the kits, and a few days later the phone started ringing with the same 6 words from every store in America. Can we have some more monsters? Within 3 years, Aurora went from $2 million in annual revenue to more than $50 million, almost entirely because of the monster kits. They were producing 8,000 kits per day, 3 kits per minute, 24 hours a day. By 1964, they had sold 7.5 million monster model kits at 98 cents each. Every single one of them was assembled by a child sitting alone at a table with a tube of Testor's cement, a set of instructions, and a vision of what the finished monster would look like on the shelf, and that child was you. Then the company that made your monsters was sold to people who did not understand them. Nabisco bought Aurora in 1971 because Nabisco wanted to be in the toy business. The first thing that happened under Nabisco was a line called Monster Scenes that included a female figure in a scene many people felt crossed the line. The National Organization for Women protested. Nabisco panicked and the kits were pulled. The executives who had never wanted to make monsters in the first place finally had their excuse to walk away. Aurora was sold again, this time to a British toy conglomerate called Dunby Combex Marks. In 1977, the company went under, and the molds, the original steel molds that had pressed out 7.5 million Frankensteins, Draculas, wolfmen, creatures, mummies, phantoms, and forgotten prisoners, were scattered. Some were sold to other companies that made inferior copies, some were lost, and some were reportedly dumped. The company that Bill Silverstein had built into a monster empire with a 98-cent Frankenstein was gone. And then the monsters themselves disappeared from your life. You went to college, or you got a job, or you joined the service, and the shelf stayed behind in your old bedroom. One day, your mother cleaned out your room. She looked at the shelf and saw 6 or 7 painted plastic monsters covered in dust. She thought they were junk and she put them in a bag. The bag went to the curb. The garbage truck took them on a Tuesday morning and they were gone. Or you moved and packed them carefully in newspaper in a box marked fragile. And the box did not make it to the new house because your parents thought the wadded up newspaper was trash and threw the whole thing away. Or you took them outside on the 4th of July and set firecrackers next to them because you were 13 and loud noises were more fun than quiet patience, and you did not understand yet that you were letting go of something you would spend the next 50 years trying to get back. One man wrote online that he broke all of his Aurora monsters when he was a teenager, and 30 years later he found out his father had collected the pieces and thrown them away, thinking they were junk. And the man was crushed when he wrote that, and the grief in his words was so raw it could have happened that morning. Every man who built Aurora monsters has a story about how he lost them. And every story ends the same way, with an empty shelf and a memory that refuses to fade no matter how many decades pass. There is a hole on every shelf in every bedroom you have lived in since the day you left home, and you have tried to fill it and you cannot. You cannot buy what Aurora sold. You can buy reproductions from companies that acquired some of the old tooling, and the plastic is similar and the shapes are close, but they are not the same because the box does not have James Bauma's painting on it, and the glue does not come in the same yellow labeled tube, and the hobby shop where you would have bought it does not exist anymore. And the boy who would have built it does not exist anymore either. Not the way he was. Not the 10-year-old with the dollar in his pocket and the Testor's cement on his fingers and the shelf above his bed where the monsters stood guard every night in the dark. 7.5 million Aurora monster kits were sold between 1961 and 1977. Every single one of them was assembled by hand. Every single one of them was painted by hand. And today, if you walk into any house in America where a man over 60 lives, you will not find one on a shelf. They are all gone. Every Frankenstein, every Dracula, every Wolfman, every creature and every phantom and every mummy and every forgotten prisoner of Castelmere. 7.5 million monsters built by 7.5 million children, and not one of them survived intact in the place where it was built. But here is what did survive: the smell. Close your eyes right now and think about Testor's cement. And tell me you cannot smell it. Tell me the sweet, sharp sting does not rise in your nose the second you read those 2 words. Tell me you cannot feel the tube in your hand, the yellow label under your thumb, the red cap between your fingers. Tell me you cannot see the gray plastic on the sprue, the instruction sheet unfolded on the table, the paint bottles lined up in a row, the Frankenstein standing on the shelf with his arms reaching out toward a room that does not exist in a house that has been sold to strangers in a childhood that ended 50 years ago but never really ended at all. Because you are still that boy, you were always that boy, and somewhere in the part of your brain that nothing can erase, the monsters are still glowing in the dark. If you built an Aurora monster, leave a comment and tell me which one was first. They deserve to be remembered, every single one of them.